Oh, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am Tom Hallam. I'm CEO of Somon Air. I live in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. A little bit of a story to tell you today. But let me start with my best answer to the subject that I was invited here to speak about, which is a little bit about my journey there. Then we'll move on to some issues that I think are important for IATA and Central Asian region. In 1971, it was not a difficult decision for me to join the United States Air Force as a pilot. The Vietnam War was active, there was a draft of conscription, and I was going to have to do something. But my father was a career Air Force pilot and officer who actually established the F-5 training program for NATO in Greece in the 1960s. My brother was already in U.S. naval pilot training. And in fact, my three brothers all became military fighter pilots and all became captains on commercial aircraft and all have retired since. I'm the one who's last not retired. But I would say with all that, aviation is basically in my blood. I loved flying fighter aircraft. I can remember vividly to this day as a young man lined up on the runway in Bangor, Maine in an F-101 doing a full afterburner takeoff with a temperature of minus 30 Celsius, that I was able to climb to 30,000 feet before I reached the end of the runway. And that sounds like an exaggeration, but when I rolled over, the runway was directly beneath me. That was in 1971, and aviation's gone a long way since then. But what an exciting time for a young 20-year-old pilot. Well, I finally gave that up, and I went to work for Delta Airlines as a commercial pilot in 1978. I also became a captain, of course, and flew as an instructor pilot and trained pilots to fly into the Delta's European and Russian operation. And so that was my first exposure to this region as a professional pilot. And it was really where I honed my skills as a teacher. It was also where I got my first exposure to the area that IATA now represents today. After retirement from Delta in 2006, I wasn't ready to give up flying, so I decided to go to work for Ethiopian Airlines as a pilot. I was the first expat to ever be interviewed for a job at Ethiopian in 30 years. They didn't pay much at that time, but as they say, you can't beat the experience. So, and that's how it turned out. What I learned there was that people elsewhere don't always, people have to seek out knowledge. It's not often shared with them or given freely. And so knowledge instead in that part of the region at the time was considered a function of power. So, well, the co-pilots at Ethiopian Airlines loved flying with me because I didn't care anything about power. I just wanted to teach people what I had learned in flying airplanes. And so in some ways it was probably professionally and personally one of the best experiences of my lifetime. But it was a great learning experience for me to move on to understanding different cultures and teaching within those cultural issues. The biggest turning point for me was when I went to Air Astana in Kazakhstan as a line captain. Soon after that, I was encouraged to go into management, and I became the senior manager of flight operations, and I was also tasked with developing their training department, the flight training department, into a separate department for the airline, which I did, and which today is a very robust training organization, including now maintenance and in-flight services. What I'll tell you about that is that it was the hardest work I had ever done in my life. And why? The reason was due to the cultural differences involved in executing change. But I stayed with it. I stayed with it until I figured it out. And fortunately, I was successful, but I measured my success with grains of sand, and something I still remember to do today. So how does an American citizen become a CEO at an airline in Tajikistan? Well, first is once you get involved in Central Asia, it's hard to get out of that region, so they keep calling me back. But I think it was my ability to work successfully within cultural differences that brought me to this current position as a CEO. I had learned patience and understanding. I'd learned to communicate carefully, and I learned to show my respect for the differences that we had. And I apply these principles every day in my job today. Somon Air is a privately owned airline. It is not state-owned. It is not state-subsidized. It's only 10 years old, but it's the first airline in Tajikistan to meet IOSA standards, to meet EASA standards through our TCO authorization, and it is the only airline in Tajikistan that is an IATA member. I'm very happy to be part of that process to bring the airline to its membership today. Most roles of Americans and other foreigners in Tajikistan are either political or diplomatic. Mine is neither, but if I do play a diplomatic role, it is one of being a bridge between the two cultures. Having said this, let me bring my attention to the challenges that I see that IATA faces in the Central Asian region. Now, in a nutshell, I would call it distance. If I get that to change. The distance of geography, the distance of culture, and the distance in stage of development. Let's start with the distance of geography. There's a view of Tajikistan in Central Asia. It's about as central as it gets. It's also the area, I'll point out, that Brian Pierce yesterday pinpointed as the center of economic focus in 2037. So I find that quite interesting and worth paying attention to. But let's backtrack. Let's talk about where we are here today in Madrid. And look at the distance there. We're over 6,000 kilometers away. I can validate about 8 hours and 30 minutes of flying with one stop in between. And so let's backtrack from there to see what kind of diversity we have between where IATA is today and where Tajikistan is also. This is where we have what I would call the old Europe, then we have the new Europe, and then we have the vast regions of course, Russia. And finally, we get to the additional CIS countries of Central Asia, which is highlighted here in gold. Let's break it down a little bit so you understand the parts of Central Asia that I'm talking about. You have Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan's in there in the red, and below that, of course, is Tajikistan. It's a huge region. It's as big as Europe is itself, geographically. It's half the size of the United States. So it raises the question for me, why are only 4 IATA airlines in this entire region members when there are hundreds in the other 2 regions? And I look to that, I think it's a bit of my next point in the distance of culture. Now, this is a very clear view of culture as it represents people and traditions and possibly languages and dress, but I'm not speaking about those issues. I'm talking about the culture and the culture in the way that a society organizes itself, which is a culture in itself, and the way that they interact within their environment. So as I go back to Central Asia to remind you our topic, What I've experienced in Central Asia is that it is much harder and much slower to implement change in a culture that was never built around the accepted international Western practices. Okay? Never. Our issue, excuse me, I better change that back. The local governments, the owners, the employees who are culturally organized differently have to be constantly reminded and guided. It's very challenging for an airline management to keep focus on the big picture when the locals have deep cultural commitments to other people and to other methods. So that is why I work very slowly and carefully in explaining and communicating why we have this necessity for change. But it's also why IATA must continue to play a major role in supporting a greater presence in this developing region if we want to take it from 4 international members, IATA members, forward to whatever possibilities might be there. As IATA develops and becomes more efficient, it can create even more distance between cultures. Let's take the ever-increasing world of acronyms just as a simple example, because it's an issue that I've had as a challenge while there. Designed as an efficient method to represent sophisticated organizations and complex concepts, just imagine yourself trying to convince your international partners to fully fund a very lengthy process that's represented by this acronym. Well, you know, you can't convince people to do something when they don't even understand it. But if we translate that, of course, into our culture, it seems very normal and very consistent. So it's just a simple example, but I try to make out my point. Then when we're talking about convincing them to be involved and to invest time and efforts and money and commitments and cultural change, when they don't even understand the acronym which represents these huge institutions, how is that done? That's done by people and presence, the presence of IATA and other organizations in the community, showing them that change, and by doing it visibly. So, I will say IATA has made progress with the airlines, but it is going slowly. Let me move to my last point, and that's the distance of stage of development. It's clear that as IATA grows and airlines in the industries mature, issues become very complex and global in nature. However, I'm asking the modern, mature IATA, don't lose sight of the distance or the challenges or the complexities going on in the emerging IATAs, where new airlines are at the very beginning stages of their development and understanding. Our issues are the same today as airlines had over 50 years ago, with the exception that the entry-level standards are much higher. So not having the advantage to grow within as the industry grew or grows, we need IATA's help and the help of other international organizations. Okay? So don't leave emerging IATA behind, because our goal is the same. We've made progress in the region, starting with Air Astana, the first IATA member of Central Asia, in 2006. 8 years later in Uzbekistan with Uzbek Airways. Last year, 2017, Somon Air in Tajikistan. And this year, back in Kazakhstan at Shymkent in Skat. So, rest assured that the current and future airline owners and investors in Central Asia are all watching this trend and witnessing the benefits. Why? because these airlines are becoming very successful. We only have to look at Air Astana and see its whole network. When I was there in 2007, it was almost at the stage that Somon Air is today. Now it's grown immensely. And so that's what's become clear to me. Today, Somon Air is clearly reaping the benefits of its only 1 year in IATA. It's learned that it takes IOSA to become a member of IATA, and it takes IATA to be able to move into code-sharing and interline and other such benefits that can grow and expand our airline and our profitability. Our routes from Dushanbe to Moscow are our oldest, and we're our most profitable. That's been going on for 10 years. But Somon Air needs to move away from its total reliance on the Russian market. And it's IATA that holds the key to that answer for us. So, in 1 year since becoming an IATA member, we've entered into a code-share agreement with a Turkish firm, Atlas Global. And you can see right here that now Istanbul to Dushanbe is as profitable to us as our Moscow to Dushanbe. 2 years ago, we were reducing our frequency to Istanbul. So, in my part of the world, this kind of progress gets a lot of attention. I'm here to capitalize on that, and I'll tell you, IATA gets most of the credit for that. So, solutions going forward. I'd like to point out up there in Air Astana at the top of my screen, that we have the IATA office. And I commend IATA for supporting that regional office. Without it, I couldn't be here to tell this story, because they've truly been instrumental in the development of aviation in Central Asia. But I will also say, more is better. It's a huge region, and it's a small office. Okay. For the same reason, I like to encourage similar support from ICAO, from the EU, from EASA, from Eurocontrol, among others, to come and send people to work with local airlines, airports, air navigation, civil aviation agencies to help us develop our infrastructure. And importantly, I'd like to see IATA invite members of the Central Asian airlines and members to participate in IATA committees, roundtables, and working groups to keep our more distant issues more front and center and help us to grow. So in conclusion, we all share the same vision, as I said, the vision that was actually shared with me at the very beginning by the owners of Somon Air when they invited me to be their American CEO. But it was one that touched me and inspired me to take this challenge in the first place. Coincidentally, it's the same vision that was later stated in the early tenure of Alexander Dejuniak as Director General and CEO of IATA, and that was the vision of freedom. Nothing could be closer to the truth than in the Republic of Tajikistan. Freedom of borders, freedom of education, freedom of commerce, freedom of tourism, freedom for them to be part of a world around them, and the freedom to fulfill their dream. So I'll conclude by finishing Alexander Dejuniak's own message of freedom, which has been referred to numerous times today at this conference, but I think a very important and profound message even now. The jobs and opportunities created by aviation are vital to modern life. The benefits of friendships built across oceans, business concluded between continents, or ideas exchanged across borders are immeasurable. Building vast distances and bridging vast distances with speed helps people build better lives. The business of freedom is powerful. Honaman Vajonaban, Tashakuri Ziyod, Barawi, Tafajud. Translated to English, thank you very much for your attention.